I'd like to start off by thanking Scott and Jim and Michael for giving me the opportunity to take part in this event and also to reflect on Stevenson in this way. It's been really interesting thinking about it. I was asked to talk about Stevenson in relation to the Scottish Literary Renaissance and to the Scottish Literary Revival. And I was going to initially talk about Revival first and Renaissance second, but actually I'm going to reverse that order and talk about Renaissance first, because I think in a way Stevenson's situation within the Scottish Literary Renaissance is rather more straightforward than his relationship with the Scottish Literary Revival. Before I do either of these things, though, I did want to just say that Stevenson worked in an extremely wide range of literary genres. He travelled across the globe. He reached transnational readerships, and the works that he was best known for, or that his writers and critics engaged with, fluctuated enormously. So at some points he was seen as a children's literature writer, as a poet, as an essayist. In recent years his critical writing has received far more attention, and of course even more recently his writing from Samoa and about Samoa and the South Pacific has received a considerable amount of attention in terms of post-colonial readings. So there's a range of works that people attach themselves to with Stevenson. And I think shifting and slippery are perhaps the ways I would describe any attempt to pin Stevenson or his influence down. Nevertheless, for any Scottish writer in the 20s or 30s, Stevenson would have been very much part of their literary consciousness. He would have been embedded in their thinking. Stevenson was a writer who was anthologised not just in Scottish collections but in anthologies of British literature in the early 20th century. So this embeddedness and the familiarity with Stevenson makes him both useful, I think, and susceptible to being deployed in various ways. Most obviously, for the writers of the Scottish Literary Renaissance, he serves to operate as a figure of the past. He represents the past. Edwin Muir writes in 1931, Stevenson has simply fallen out of the procession. Catherine Carswell, 10 years later, regrets that Stevenson and Ibsen are two writers I can't believe I shall ever want to reread, though both of them once meant so much to me. In fact, Carswell was interested in writing a play about Stevenson. And Lorna Moon, complaining about the blurb that has been suggested for her novel Dark Star, writes, I don't like the part in which says she belongs to the Scottish heroines of literature and that Scott and Stevenson and Barry would have understood her, because they wouldn't. Thank God, Nancy is 1929. So Stevenson is a figure of the past as opposed to Nancy, who is part of modernity. So in these critics, in these writers, Stevenson serves to symbolise both the past and to be deployed in indicating a rupture with the past. His writing is also frequently invoked as a point of comparison when writers want to talk about the use of Scots. So John Buchan, for example, says that Violet Jacob writes Scots because what she has to say could not be written otherwise. Hers is a living speech with the accent of the natural voice and not a skillful mosaic of selected words, which is what you get in the poems of Stevenson. Edwin Muir, writing about Linklater and Gibbon, says they write about Scottish life for a Scottish audience and not for an English one like Stevenson. These writers are in any case more intimately Scottish than Stevenson was, and that justifies one in calling the literary revival to which they belong a Scottish one. And even Kurt Wittig, who is a fan of Stevenson's, notes that Stevenson, while he had a finer command of the vernacular than Scott, his style, as in Strawn Janet, is often too literary, with a scattering of folk idioms tacked into it, almost as if it was a translation of Stevenson's English style, Scotticised. Hugh MacDiarmid, writing as Christopher Murray Grieve, has a little more praise for Thrawn Janet and Weir of Hermiston, and describes them as almost all of Stevenson's work that survives in the keen air of pure literature. His immortality, however, is on a lower plane where the great masses to whom the heights are unacknowledgeable can breathe with unconscious freedom. He took the gay road, the open road, the broad road that ensures perpetual popularity. And that accusation of Stevenson being too popular, of being a people pleaser, of being trapped by his popularity, is echoed by Edwin Muir when he notes the defiantly picturesque pose which Stevenson assumed was merely a cloak under which he hoped to conceal the humiliating function, that of having to please everyone else. But this essay by Muir is interesting in another way for the way in which it positions Stevenson, because he notes he was younger than his years, for he had spent his childhood and youth in a country where everything combined to prevent an imaginative writer from coming to maturity. He has been nauseously praised for his boyish irresponsibility. And this idea of Stevenson as immature, as a boy, as not quite an adult, is epitomised perhaps in the words of Hugh MacDiarmid, who wrote of Stevenson in an essay, RLS in the Future, which, as you can tell, probably doesn't think RLS is very much part of the future. He is the Peter Pan of letters. He remains forever romantically poised on the very threshold of manhood, but he can never cross that threshold, remains an elfin figure framed in distant sunlight, very small, very beautiful, very remote. So we might want to think, I suppose, about the ways in which Stevenson functions in a kind of gender discourse that's going on here. He is not fully masculine. There is a certain amount of irony, of course, that Stevenson, who by the end of his life had travelled the globe and ended up in Samoa, supporting an extended family and acting as a patriarch for them in all kinds of ways, is presented as boyish and irresponsible. But nevertheless, that is an image that is very much attached to Stevenson and is used again to create a point of difference with what I suppose is the more masculinised writings of the Scottish literary Renaissance. So Stevenson is associated with the past, he's associated with perhaps a not entirely authentic kind of Scottishness, he's associated with an absence of masculinity, with a boyishness, and he's also very much associated with narratives of loss. So Cairns Craig talks about the period between the 1870s and the 1920s as blighted, a blighted narrative, and he picks out the death of certain writers, including Stevenson, as contributing to that blighted narrative, that narrative of loss. And I think it's fair to say that that narrative of loss circles around Stevenson from the very moment of his death, perhaps even before his death, because he's gone to Samoa. But there is nevertheless a very powerful narrative of loss, and it's a narrative of loss which is particularly tied in to Weir of Hermiston. So Edward Burlingham, the editor at Scribner's, writes to Sidney Colwyn that he'd only had the opportunity to read Hermiston in advanced sheets, but it's the finest of all, and its incompleteness a loss to be regretted for all time. And Henry James, writing to Colvin, notes that this is what he was doing so splendidly when he died. So Weir of Hermiston operates at the very pinnacle of this narrative of loss. And I think it's a narrative, again, that we might want to be suspicious of. Nevertheless, there are ways in which Stevenson emerges with greater positivism. Kurt Wittig, although he again invokes this narrative of loss and rupture by suggesting that Stevenson's gift was too great for his immediate successor, so there was a vacuum after his early death, nevertheless notes the ways in which he bred the traditional ballad and folktale with literary traditions, and Wittig positions him in a chapter entitled heaving again, in which he sees the rebirth of Scottish literature. Douglas Gifford goes even further by suggesting that what we can see in Stevenson is a cathartic negativism that is part of what you might find in writers of the Revival and Renaissance, a sustained critique of Scottish society and culture. So how then might we think about Stevenson in relation to revivalism? If he serves simply as a point of difference and a point of rupture and critique for the Renaissance writers. A very obvious example of the respect in which Stevenson was held is Patrick Geddis's description of the funeral of John Stuart Blackie in Edinburgh, published in the Evergreen, in which he explicitly links the funeral of Blackie, the funeral pageant of Blackie in Edinburgh, with that of Stevenson in Samoa. And again, still invoking this narrative of loss, talks about the leader of nationality in ripest age and the leader of literature in fullest prime have alike left us. But perhaps Geddes is using that narrative of loss in a rather more positive way in talking about ways in which we can move on from that. So that's a very obvious example of kind of direct invocation of Stevenson in relation to revivalism. But I want to talk now about three important books, I think, that offer more nuanced readings of Stevenson's intersections with the Scottish literary revival. The first of these is Joseph Farrell's book, Robert Louis Stevenson in Samoa. And Farrell identifies in Stevenson a consistent bohemianism. All his days he would present life as a disputed field between the bourgeois and the bohemian, where he identified with the latter and viewed himself, and importantly perhaps self-deceptively, as the independent thinker unharnessed by convention. Farrell's qualifier that his beliefs and bohemian beliefs and behaviour should not be overstated is a good one, I think, and the idea that this conflict was always unresolved is also very powerful. But Farrell uses Stevenson's bohemianism to make links with decadence. And he also uses, as many other critics have done, his imaginative engagement in the South Seas with Polynesian culture and his anthropological interest in different societies as a way of exploring the links between contemporary Samoa and post-Jacobite Scotland. So it's incredibly, that dynamic is incredibly generative, and generative in ways that might be linked with the literary revival. Michael Shaw, and I'm sure Michael will have more to say about this in the event itself, notes various aspects of Stevenson's work that might be linked to revivalism. Firstly, the way in which he represents the relationship between Highland and Lowlanders, interrogating their supposed ethnic and cultural foreignness. So they're not seen as different and divided. He suggests that Stevenson's romances acknowledge Scotland's civic and cultural distinctions and distance Scotland from English identity. And perhaps most importantly, he argues that in Stevenson, and he's drawing here on the work of Julia Reid and Rosalind Jolly, there are challenges to notions of linear progress and stadialism. So his anthropological interest, his interest in primitivism, his scientific interest in primitivism, challenges notions of progress and also invoke a concern with the relationship of the individual to ancestry and the ways in which familial and national ancestries overlap. And thirdly, Louisa Gairm, in her really excellent study Ecology in Modern Scottish Literature, which I feel sometimes hasn't been given enough recognition, makes a strong case for reading Stevenson in ecological terms, thinking about his interest in moving through the world as a way of being in the world. She describes him as a rural flaneur. And she concludes her study of Stevenson and ecology by noting that he suggests the possibility of a sensitive, responsible global consciousness, similar to John Muir, and argues that these ideas are central to the mode of Scottish ecological thought developed by Geddes, which she discusses, but also links with the synthesis of the cosmic and regional that you can find in Hugh McDermott and Grassic Gibbon's writings. So these are three rather different approaches to Stevenson, which nevertheless make a strong case for his links with the literary revival. But even Michael Shaw, who I think is most dedicated to this argument, does confess there is what he calls in Stevenson an intermittent Celticism. And going back to my point about Stevenson being shifty and slippery and difficult to pin down, I think we might want to just pause and consider that intermittent Celticism. And I want to finish really by giving three examples of where we might see that at play, but also being qualified. A very obvious example is taken from chapter 16 in Kidnapped, where David Balfour is in a boat that is in the same piece of water as a boat taking emigrants away to America, and the people in both boats start singing Loch Aber No More, and everyone is emotionally affected by this. Even David Balfour, he notes that the tears running down the men and women, the cheeks of the men and women, and the music of the song were highly affecting, even to myself. So this is a moment at which David gives way to what we might call a kind of Celtic effect, to an emotional engagement with Scottish identity, even though he almost immediately steps back from that. My second example is Stevenson's poem Ticonderoga, which he wrote actually just after the death of his father in 1887, but chose to include in his poetry collection Ballads, which is predominantly made up of ballads from Polynesia. But he put this Scottish ballad in there, and it's a Scottish ballad which tells the story of a Cameron who ends up giving shelter through the rules of Highland hospitality to the man who has slain his brother. His brother then appears to him as a ghost and utters the words Ticonderoga, which mean nothing to him, and they mean nothing to him through the many years of his life until he ends up as a soldier fighting in North America. And when he bit the dust, far from the hills of heather, far from the isles of the sea, he sleeps in the place of the name as it was doomed to be. And this is a poem that very much plays with ideas of destiny and doom and a kind of Celtic community that stretches across the globe. But that global dimension, I think, is also very interesting because the Cameron's death at Ticonderoga is unexpected, it's unpredictable, it's part of a broader world narrative that moves far beyond Scotland and perhaps resituates the Scottish tale itself. And my final example of this shiftingness or slipperiness in Stevenson is from his own description of talking to the Samoans about their own history and sharing tales of Highland life with them. And a number of critics have written about the commonalities that Stevenson saw in this and how that fed into his anthropological interest and distrust of progressivism. But it's interesting, I think, to note that when he describes talking to the Samoans with about their histories. He says, when I desired any detail of savage custom or superstitious belief, I cast back in the stories of my fathers and fished for what I wanted with some trait of equal barbarism. Each of these I found to be a killing bait. And that killing bait, again, is a rather more detached and cynical perspective on a shared sense of history and community. Stevenson is deploying it quite self-consciously to get the kinds of stories that he wants. So, as I said earlier, I think it's quite difficult to pin Stevenson down, and the attachments of both the literary Renaissance and the literary revival to his writing, they're quite complicated to unpick. I want to throw one final term. We've been talking a lot about rupture and reaction and so on. The final term perhaps I want to introduce when thinking about Stevenson is seepage, because I think Stevenson, as I said earlier, is so embedded, so familiar, that his words seep into the consciousness of Scottish writers from the 1880s, the 1890s, into the 20s and 30s and beyond, even when writers are wanting to distance themselves from them. I'll just leave you with one final example, a very famous passage from Stevenson's essay, The Scots Abroad, when he talks about how if Scots meet anywhere outside Scotland, they will fall upon each other. Ready-made affection joins us on the instant. And the rhythms of this passage are surprisingly echoed, as are the sentiments, in Willa Muir's Imagined Corners, when towards the end of the novel, the narrator, depicts the hierarchy of housewives in Calderwick and notes that while there are very strict hierarchies and distinctions between them, if they were to meet on a desert island or in an English town, these Scottish housewives would fall upon each other's necks. And I think the echoes of Stevenson are so strong there that it's hard not to see some kind of seepage coming through. So perhaps that's a term we might also want to think about in relation to reaction and rupture and revival.